I'm Linda Solomon Wood, and this is Conversations. My interview tonight is with author Seth Klein, and that's coming up in a moment. But first, I'm so pleased to introduce Erin Robinsong, an award-winning poet and interdisciplinary artist working with ecological imagination. Erin joins us from Montreal. Hey, Erin, how are you?
Hi, Linda. I'm good. Yeah, it's just such an honor to join you for this event. Seth Klein's book is just one of the most inspiring and galvanizing book on the climate crisis that I have read. And your approach really reminds me that revolution means going in a circle and like returning to something that we once knew about how to act, not even very long ago, about how to act in an emergency. So I'm excited to open for that.
Thank you.
I'm going to start. Should I start now?
Yeah.
I'm going to start with a prayer called Late Prayer. Late Prayer. May our weapons be effective, feminine inventions that like life. May we blow up like weeds and be medicinal and everywhere. May the disturbed ground be our pharmacy. May the exhausted hang out in the beautiful light. May our souls moisten and reveal us. May the oligarchs get enough to eat in their souls. May our actions be deft as the inhale after a dream of suffocation. May we participate in the intelligence we're in. May we grow into our name. May political harm be a stench that awakens. May we not be distracted. May our joy repeated be power that spreads. May our wealth be common. May oligarchs come out of their fortresses and become psychologically well. May their wealth be returned to the people and places. May we shift, slide, rise, tilt, roll, and twist. May we feel the very large intimacy, and may it assist us. I'm going to read one more called Members of Weather, and I actually rewrote this poem for this event. Members of weather, fire weather, roof peeling weather, house sliding away weather, boat down the road weather, Haiyan weather, crop failure weather, sliding away or hurtling weather, drying up or filling up with weather, falling ice shelf weather, polar vortex weather, sandy weather, ice cap melting weather, unseasonable disease-friendly sandbag weather, crops washing away weather, snow in the Sahara, European ski resort closure weather, bedbug weather, coral bleaching weather, coffee blight, blackout, stressor weather, Katrina weather, cultural aggression weather, at all costs wealthier weather, redwoods moving north, weather wall, weather skull, storm shelter wealth weather, island nation flattening or subsuming weather, salt in the water table weather. Is the economy as strong as air? Is policy as unstoppable as fire? We could elect the climate to power, since it already is in power, in power, in power, in power. In the greening, singing, pulsing place, the gleaming, responding, revolving place, the trying and the meeting place, being from around here, around rotational place. I crave revolution, crave that curve. It's what we do around here in the whirling world.
Well, Erin, that was so beautiful and so profound. Thank you so much. What a beautiful opening. And I just want to let everybody know, all couple of hundred of you who are now on the call with us, that Erin will be reading again at the end of our hour. So now I'm very, very glad, and I feel very privileged to introduce you to someone who you probably already know, Seth Klein. Seth is a columnist with National Observer. You might know him from his work with us, but you've probably followed him during his 20-year career at the BC Center for Policy Alternatives, or you've read his recent book, which really so many people are talking about these days. So many people are quoting from it. I just see it all over the place. And that book is A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. Seth, so great to have you here today.
Hi, Linda. It's great to be with you.
Well, let's get right into it, Seth. Let's start with this question. How is the climate emergency like a war?
Well, at its very basic level, they're both foundational existential threats. They're both moments of profound challenge to the future of civilization. So that's the most immediate comparison. But I found so many more in the book, of course. And incidentally, the book that that it's become isn't the book that it started out to be. I hadn't planned to structure the whole thing around lessons from the Second World War. I was only going to do one chapter on that. But as I delved into that, I started to see so many parallels across so many areas. It also jolted my thinking about how we think and approach emergencies. One of the comparisons, though, that was striking to me is they both start from a period of denial. All emergencies start with a period of denial, right? We can all remember 14 months ago, we were all in denial about what COVID would be for us. And a lot of us assume that we declare war in September 1939 and everyone was there and ready to rally. Not true.
Mm-hmm.
This was a population and a leadership that wasn't at all keen to do what was actually necessary. And I think that's similar to the climate crisis. Mostly, and Erin was talking about this, I found there this inspiring story of speed and scale once we realized that we had to confront an emergency, and then tried to excavate that story to remind ourselves of what we're actually capable of.
That speed and scale is part of what we saw during COVID. But tell us more about how you saw that unfold in World War II, in your research on World War II, and how you relate that to now.
Well, first of all, World War II is this, a lot of people use the language of needing to mobilize for climate, but that is an example of what full societal mobilization actually looks like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Out of a population base of about 11 million Canadians at the time, over a million enlisted, over a million were directly employed in military production. I mean, the scale of that is pretty extraordinary, isn't it? And my book is particularly interested in the ramp up of military production on the home front. And so starting from a scale of a base of virtually nothing, there was nothing really to speak of in the way of military production in Canada before the war. Over those 6 years, from a population less than a third what it is today, we produced 16,000 aircraft, ultimately producing the fourth largest air force in the world, 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined, about 700 ships. So the speed and scale of all of that was mind-blowing. And I became utterly fascinated by that and the question of how that was actually done and what kind of leadership allowed that to happen.
And what kind of leadership did allow that to happen?
Well, so the person who I became particularly fascinated by in the book is this fellow, C.D. Howe, who was the Minister of Munitions and Supply, overseeing all of this military production in the Mackenzie King government. And he became so fascinating to me. He was no lefty, he was on the right of the right wing of the Mackenzie King cabinet. Had come from the private sector, had made a lot of money in the private sector before going into politics, but he just became seized by the task. And I describe him as an engineer in a hurry. And what's remarkable to me about him is that when you look at the level of economic planning that he brought to this, so careful coordination of all of the supply chains to prioritize military production, happy to give contracts to the private sector, but anytime the private sector couldn't quickly do what needed doing, he created another crown corporation. he created 28 crown corporations in the course of the war in order to produce all of that. And that to me stands in such contrast with the approach we take in the present, where we've created no new crown corporations in order to expedite this federally or provincially. Um, and where the approach that we take is about incentivizing the production that has to happen, right? You saw the latest federal budget. What do we do in terms of producing what we need to produce? We offered a 50% corporate income tax cut. Where how didn't do that? How knew that you couldn't incentivize our way to victory? You had to seize hold of it, and that's what I did.
You know, bear with me on this a moment, but when Canada and when the United States got into the war, World War II, the fairy book story is that it was done out of an altruistic desire to help save Europe and, the Jewish population from the camps. But in fact, when you delve into the history, you find out America was very reluctant to go to war. And forgive me, but I don't know Canada's history as well. But how do you see that? Because actually, other forces were at work that drove them into the war. What were can you talk about that a little bit? Like, what kind of tipping point do you think it will take? Obviously, not altruistic. It's hard, that seems still in the realm of fairy tale.
Mm-hmm.
What are the economic forces or political forces that will really drive action on climate change?
Well, let's talk about in those war years what it took to actually bring a population, whether it was Canadian or American, on board.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I first started to share with people that I was writing this book and what its framework was, people would often say, "Oh, well, but in the war, everyone understood the threat to be clear and present." Compared to that's not true.
No.
If you were in Europe, it was clear and present. But if
Mhm.
you were in Canada or the United States, it was on the other side of two oceans.
Right.
And so it actually did take leadership to bring the population on board, to shift the popular zeitgeist
Mhm.
into emergency mode. And of course, in the American case, it took 2 years longer.
Mhm.
Now, by the way, this is one of the pieces of the Canadian story that I quite like, because on climate, often you hear the refrain, "Oh, Canada's so small. Even if we were to do everything we're supposed to do, what does it matter?" But of course, we didn't wait on the Americans World War II. And in fact, for most of those 2 years, we were the only country in the Western Hemisphere engaged in that war. And at the end of it,
Mm.
nobody questioned the value and importance of Canada's contributions.
Mm.
And why did we go earlier?
That's amazing.
Partly Canada went earlier because of its ties to Britain.
Mhm.
But it's important to appreciate that while the declaration of war in Canada happened earlier, it didn't all happen at once. In fact, even the question of whether or not Canada would send troops overseas remained an open question, and if we did, to what extent. Um, and so there was a lot of work to bring the population on board. In the US, it took 2 years. There was an important role, I should say to you, Linda, given who you are. The media played an important role in the United States, in particular the CBS News team, headed up by Edward R. Murrow, is
Right.
credited with helping to bring about a 20 percentage point change in US public opinion from opposition to joining the war to support for joining the war. But the last thing I want to say on this point is this. The early mobilization and recruitment efforts in Canada were weak. When we asked a public to just kind of go after these bad guys on the other side of the world, there was people signed up, but not in the numbers required. What ultimately happened, and this is a key lesson in my book for the present,
Mhm.
what they realized is that if they were actually going to achieve the mobilization, if they were actually going to get the volunteer recruitment enlistment numbers that they wanted to hit, they
Mhm.
had to engage Canadians in a conversation about what kind of society they would come back to.
Mhm.
And you see the first major income transfer programs come in during the war: unemployment insurance, the family allowance, uh, tax increases on the wealthy and corporations. The
Mm.
whole architecture for the whole post-war welfare state is written during the war and is offered up to Canadians as a
Mm.
pledge that the country they will come back to will look different and more just than the one they were leaving behind. That's when you get the mobilization. That's when you get the recruitment numbers. And all of that has an echo in the present appeal of the Green New Deal today. That when you link the fight on climate with tackling inequality, the support for mobilization on climate doesn't go down, it goes through the roof. That's what that linkage is what you need to do when you're asking people to engage in a great undertaking together.
In your book, you were just talking about, you write about how crown corporations were used to handle Canada's war mobilization during World War One. Which ones, sorry, during World War Two, which ones do you think could help today with fighting climate change and mobilizing the public? Like if you were, what was his name? C.K. Howe?
C.D. Howe.
C.D. Howe. Like, what
so
would you do?
I actually have a 3-page list of these possible new generation crown corporations in the book. And that was one of the fun exercises to go through, is to say, okay, here's this guy, like I said, no lefty. He comes up with all these crowns. What was the logic by which he chose those? And then you map the same logic onto the present, and you say, what would those be today? Before I tell you examples, I guess the first point I want to make is, why do I fixate on crowns? Because if you aren't creating new public enterprises, the best you can do as a government is to try to incentivize somebody else to do what's needed. The most recent example of that, there's lots the federal government has done right in this pandemic. In audacious new programs they created, like the CERB and the wage subsidy. What they didn't do in the early days is recreate, because we used to have one, a crown corporation to mass produce vaccines. And so what happens? We become entirely dependent on imports from elsewhere. Even worse, we use our economic muscle to outbid poorer countries. In the war, we were an arsenal for our allies, using those crown corporations. So, what I say in the present is, like C.D. Howe, conduct an inventory of everything we need. How many solar arrays, how many wind farms, how many electric buses, how many heat pumps? And then imagine a new generation of crown corporations to mass produce and deploy these at the requisite scale. I'll give you one example. A year ago, I went through the process, as I wrote about last week for the Observer, getting the gas out of my house and switching to electric heat pump. It was complicated. It was expensive, even with the rebates. I came out of the experience thinking, man, if this is how we're going to do that, we're in big trouble, because very few people are going to do what I've just done. And in fact, the data tells us that very few people are doing it.
Yeah.
What if we had a crown corporation or a subsidiary of an existing hydro corporation that was mass producing HFC-free heat pumps, get the profits out of it, get the economies of scale, bring the price down, have an army of installers who come into our homes, make it easy, and we can start to imagine what this could look like at scale.
Well, I guess we have to go to your book to get the full list of crown corporations. Tell me, you did some polling for the book, Seth. What did you ask Canadians about? What did you find out?
So first of all, let me tell you why I did the polling. First of all, I was frustrated by a lot of the polling that a lot of environmental groups had commissioned, that they were polling on incremental questions that are irrelevant to the current emergency, because the incremental days, we've run out the clock on those, haven't we? Secondly, I was interviewing a bunch of politicians for the book and political insiders. And I was only interested in interviewing politicians who I believe get the climate, and yet whose governments and parties aren't actually pursuing a true climate emergency plan.
Which were those? Like, give us an idea.
Well, like the BC NDP, like the Alberta NDP, like the federal Liberals. These governments all practice what I call the new climate denialism, which is to say they don't deny the climate science. They accept the climate science and then pursue a policy agenda that is incongruous with what the science says we have to do. That's what I mean. Why? And when you press these folks on that question of why, the answer always came back to some variant of the line, well, you got to meet the public where they're at, and they're not there yet. So I
Mm.
wanted to do the poll with Abacus in order to test that
Mhm.
presumption.
Mhm.
And big picture, what I found, now, first of all, I should say I found that answer really annoying because having been studying World War II, the striking thing about those leaders from World War II is that they didn't meet the public where they were at. They took the public where they needed to go. But I still wanted to test the presumption. And what I found was a public that is, in fact, ahead of our politics, both in terms of understanding climate as an emergency,
Mhm.
and secondly, their preparedness to accept truly bold climate policies, by which I mean well beyond what any
Mhm.
party is offering. And that was hopeful.
That's really interesting because I've had a number of politicians come in these conversations, in these interviews, talk about, that very thing, needing the public behind them. Really, the public has to come first. And even Bill McKibben, if I remember correctly, said leaders don't really lead. It's really they follow the public. So
Mhm.
just can you tell me more about your insights about that?
Well, they do follow the public. And so that's why the moment we're at is a political one where we have to build the demand for a
Mhm.
true climate emergency plan.
Mhm.
But I also think we ought rightly to expect more leadership from our leaders.
Mhm.
And so when you delve into the opinion polling, and I know you've done some, our mutual friend Chris Hatch has done wonderful work on this, right? Where what you find is growing anxiety about climate.
Mhm.
You have that 25% who, like us, the climate alarmed. We're
Mhm.
there. And
Mhm.
then you get this group in the middle, a big chunk in the middle,
Mhm.
45% or so, who are confused. They are worried about climate.
Mhm.
They know we need to do something, but
Mhm.
their level of climate literacy is appalling, right? They don't even equate. If you start asking them about climate, they start talking about recycling and plastics, right? They don't even equate it with fossil fuel combustion. Um, Now, if you're the federal liberals, you make mischief with these people. It's very easy to tell those people to give those people the impression that you're doing something
Yeah.
when you're not doing nearly enough.
Yeah.
Um, and and I think those folks are going to. I think posterity is not going to look kindly on those people. Whereas the people we look back to from World War II, what is remarkable about them is that they were forthright with the public about the gravity of the crisis. And they
Yeah.
told the truth, and our leaders
It's
aren't
like
telling the truth.
when people, say, well, don't try to protect their children from the truth of things. And, we learn time and again that children do better when they actually know the truth. And we're not children. And so why are our leaders not willing to just say it like it is? But that gets back to Seth. Are we then talking about that's what they say because they're just controlled by the oil and gas industry? Or, what were your findings about that? And I'm also interested in that 45% who you say are confused. Are they just too busy to focus on it? I've asked you two different questions.
Yeah.
So let's
Well,
talk first about leaders.
they're related because partly why they're
Mhm.
confused, the level of climate literacy being as low as it is an indictment both of the mainstream media and of our leadership.
Mhm.
Um, that neither of those institutions are being forthright and straight with them. And so the literacy remains low. Um, why aren't our leaders being bolder? It's complicated. Some of it is indeed the power and strength of the fossil fuel industry blocking progress, and a political orientation. And I use this term advisedly, connected to the analogy that I'm using. The dominant impulse of our center left political leaders
Mhm.
is to seek to appease the fossil fuel industry,
Mhm.
right? If you're Justin Trudeau or Rachel Notley or John Horgan with your climate plan, you want to be able to have a bunch of industry leaders on the stage with you
Mhm.
announcing your climate plan to show that you have won their support.
Yeah.
Um, what I'm arguing in the book is at this late hour, any climate plan that is seeking the consent of that industry is not a climate plan worth having. Because if they don't feel our climate plans to be ultimately an existential threat to them,
Yeah.
it's not really a plan.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And that's
but
what your last column was about.
right,
Time
very
to
much.
stop, appeasing them,
Yes,
basically.
yes.
So, Seth, I wonder what you think about environmental organizations in Canada. Are they putting good ideas forward, in your view, that reflect where the public's at? You touched on that before. Can you speak more about that?
Oh, I mean, there's lots of environmental groups doing a lot of amazing work, and it's hard to paint them all with the one broad brush. I mean, they're kind of the degree to which some of them are truly in emergency mode, others aren't. Um, in some ways, though, my answer to this is dovetails with my answer to the other one. Part of what holds us all back,
Mhm,
both political leaders and the leaders of many environmental organizations,
mhm, mhm,
is the 40-year legacy of neoliberalism. Neil, what I'm arguing in the book and in my work now is to say, here are the four markers of emergency when you know you're there. You spend what it takes to win, you create new economic institutions to get the job done. You move from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures, and you tell the truth. Those are the four markers.
mm.
Now, we're not doing any of those on climate at any level of any federal or provincial government. But why? Why don't our leaders, including environmental leaders, say, spend what it takes to win, create new crowns, just use the regulatory power of the state to require change? Because 40 years of neoliberalism have told them those things aren't allowed or practical anymore. And so we need to bust out of the straitjacket of those assumptions. And in an odd way, the pandemic actually helps bust us out of that.
Seth, there's a few questions coming into the chat. There's a lot of conversation going on in the chat, and I just want to acknowledge that I'm kind of seeing that. And one of the question is, or a bunch of people have asked, about rationing travel like in the wartime era. What do you think about that idea, employing measures like that?
I do talk about the possibility of rationing in the book. I think you can ration. You could allow for a level of choice depending on the model you take. You can have carbon quotas, for example, that
Mhm.
let people decide how they want to allocate their carbon quotas between travel and diet and other things. Um, in the book, I actually say, let's keep, that's a pretty extreme measure. So let's keep it in the back pocket till like 2025 and see if we're on target. And if we're not, we're going to have to bring out the big guns. But this relates more broadly to my third marker, right? Moving from voluntary to mandatory. Why is it that as a country, all we have managed to do is flatline our emissions? We have failed to bend the curve, to put this in the parlance we've all come to know in the pandemic. Because if you survey all of our federal and provincial climate policies to date, what they all have in common, almost all of them, is that they're voluntary. We encourage change, we incentivize change, we give rebates, we send price signals. What we do not do is require change. But again,
He
there
asked
is
nicely.
Yes, nicely, exactly. Please. Now it's interesting because when the US and Britain and Canada were all considering rationing in the war, they worried about a real public backlash, which
Mhm,
never materialized. In
mhm,
fact, it became very popular
mhm.
because it was fair. And similarly, in this pandemic, we've seen people, again, the public was ahead of our politics saying, make it mandatory, require masks. And
Yeah.
I think the same is true on climate, that people are saying, you know, new buildings and vehicles, make it mandatory. Now, why is that? Because I think at one level, in the main, there's always the denier group, right? But in
Mhm,
the main, most of us want to do the right thing.
mhm.
Except we don't want to be chumps. No one wants to do the right thing and feel like their neighbor isn't. And and so
Yeah.
we like these measures because then we know everyone's in.
Yeah, yeah. Seth, we're going to take a really short break here. I have two questions that we're going to get to after this little short break. One is about the Ferry Creek protesters, which I'll ask you. But first, For those of you just tuning in, I'm Linda Solomon Wood. I'm editor-in-chief of Canada's National Observer, and I'm here with Seth Klein, author of A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. Seth's also a columnist at National Observer. And let me tell you a little bit about National Observer for those of you who are new to it. Every day, we bring you the best of fact-based climate journalism, hard-hitting investigations, and news and analysis you just won't find anywhere else. So I hope, if you haven't already, that you'll join our community now, right now, by subscribing. And I wanted to let you know that our readers do make up an incredible community. They're generous, they're engaged, they're inspired. I should say you are, because I know a lot of you are on the call. And they're critical thinkers. So please join us, subscribe or donate, and make more great journalism happen. So tell me.
Can I say something? Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I want to say, first of all, I was a subscriber before I was a columnist.
Yes.
And have been for many years.
Mhm.
And folks, Linda didn't ask me to say this, but I'm going to say it. I appreciate getting the Observer in my inbox every morning, because you're in emergency mode, but you are unusual in the media landscape. There is a part of the book that looks at the role of media, looks at the role of media in the war, as we touched on earlier, and the role of the CBC, which thankfully was created 3 years before the war and played a key role in mobilizing the public.
Mhm.
To which I ask, what about today, right? Like, if every hour, every morning on the radio, we can get hourly business reports and hourly sports reports,
Yeah.
then surely to God, we could have a morning climate emergency report, like your inbox, like my inbox with the National Observer, telling us how this battle for our lives is unfolding every day around the world. And like you want it to be strong journalistically. You want it to be fact based and grounded in science. But in the face of a civilizational threat, we also want our mainstream media and our public broadcaster
Yeah.
To pick a goddamn side.
Yeah.
And share it with us every day.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Seth. I have a question from Robert Miller, who asked if you'd comment today on the arrests of Ferry Creek protesters. That's a little bit off topic, but I think everyone would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I haven't heard today's news. I know that the rest have been happening for the last few days. So if something new has happened today, I've missed it.
There were more people arrested.
I feel gratitude to them. So that forestry fight is, of course, linked to the climate fight. These old growth forests are key repositories of carbon. But I also think in what we're seeing, and I talk about this in the book, everyone has to figure out their part in this fight. But for some people, and in increasing numbers of people, it's peaceful civil disobedience. And I can't think of a successful social movement that didn't have some element of peaceful civil disobedience. That's part of shifting the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that.
And actually, if I may, there is, as I was writing the book, there's a bit of a Where's Waldo game in the book, of spot the rule breaker. The people who, in the face of a civilizational threat, defied the rules and the norms of their time and throw out the rule book. And they're littered throughout the wartime story in the book and in the present. Those are the people we remember.
Yeah.
And those rule breakers in the present, whether they're civil disobedience or land defenders or student strikers, I'm convinced these are the people we'll remember decades from now.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, I think of the analogy between the war and climate. And what really strikes me about it is that, that the climate crisis is obvious and also not. So it's very silent, slow killer.
That is the curse of climate.
Yeah.
Relative to the war and relative to COVID is that it moves in slow motion. And that allows politicians to kick the can down the road.
Right.
But one of the things the polling I did shows is the degree to which people, the terrain of public opinion has already shifted over the last few years from seeing the threat as somewhere else, sometime in the future, to here and now. And just to tie this into Erin's second poem off the top, right? She lists those extreme weather events.
Yes.
And what I do in the book is suggest that we recast those as attacks on our soil. That's how we should think about them as part of a mobilization.
I'm going to throw in one more question from the chat and then go back to my interview. But Barbara Andrew asks, "How has you spoke to this, Seth, and this is a follow up. How has the pandemic helped in busting us out of 40 years of neoliberalism?"
So, because, as I say, what's hamstrung us in the present on climate is, this feeling like all these things we need to do are no longer practical or allowed. And so much of that's been blown out of the water in this pandemic. We have all, appreciate for a moment the awkwardness of the timing here, right? I wrote my whole book before the pandemic. I thought, to come back to Erin's first poem, I thought we needed to excavate this historic reminder of how quickly we're capable of pivoting.
Yeah.
And then I handed it off for final copy edit 3 days before the first lockdown. And then I was like, well, I was in a bit of a panic, to be honest with you, because now here we've all been living through that in real time.
Yeah.
But it shows how quickly we're capable of pivoting.
Yeah.
If you had asked me 15, 16 months ago, are there people at Finance Canada and the Bank of Canada who could quickly pivot within weeks and create these audacious programs like the CERB and the wage subsidy? Linda, I would have told you no, that there's no one home who thinks that way. And I would have been proven wrong, because they did. In particular, that Bank of Canada story, just to get a little wonky with you, and to offer up an important comparison.
Yeah.
Since that first lockdown until a couple of months ago, Bank of Canada, our Crown Corporation central bank, was buying up federal government securities in order to finance the emergency response to the tune of $5 billion a week. Now this, after all of the years of being told on climate and homelessness and poverty, there's not enough money. But when remarkable what happens. Now think about that $5 billion a week. The Trudeau government, they've had big announcements of different things on climate in the last few months. They don't make it very easy for journalists, right? Because these announcements the money is spread over 3 years here and 5 years here and 7 years. So my former colleagues at the CCPA have done us a service here, and they've tried to break that down into an annual figure, and that annual figure is about $5 billion a year, compared to $5 billion on the pandemic a week. But now the cat's out of the bag. Now we see what's possible if and when our governments get the emergencies to be emergencies.
Why do you think they were willing to spend like that on COVID and not on other issues that are life and death issues for Canadians?
I mean, part of it is about what I was saying before, the time, the speed of it. And once people realized the nature of a pandemic and how quickly it can move compared to climate, it galvanized a lot of activity. But remember, that didn't happen in all countries. There are countries in the world where their leaders, whether it's Trump or Bolsonaro or Modi, who didn't do it. But our governments did. And I've been struck by this question of what is the alchemy of these moments, whether it's the war, the pandemic, or climate. That combination of events and leadership that shifts the zeitgeist. On the pandemic, I joke that we can all think about it, because it wasn't that long ago, what it was. I mean, I remember when they canceled the NBA season. And I remember thinking, wow, I don't even watch basketball, Linda, but I remember thinking, that's weird. But then I know for sure that it took seeing my prime minister in front of his house every morning. And that communicated emergency.
Yeah.
Emergencies need to look and sound and feel like emergencies.
Yeah.
But on climate, for whatever unfortunate combination of reasons, even though we're seeing some progress federally and
Hmm.
we have a bit of a plan provincially, but none of them are emergency plans. And
Hmm.
think about the contrast. There's nothing about the federal approach to climate that looks like a grand societal undertaking or that invites us to join in such a thing.
You look at other countries where debates over climate policy aren't as partisan as in North America and where movement is happening faster. Why have countries like Norway and Ireland been able to keep climate change on the political agenda, regardless of how left or right the government is, and why can't we?
Well, I think in all of these cases, whether it's
Mhm,
other countries, and there are some Canadian cases,
mhm,
uh, it's that magic combination of the right people in leadership with the right kind of social movement pressure from below.
mhm.
Um, Let me give you the examples of countries that you give are inspiring and worthwhile. And you guys have published Barry's excellent work that disabuse Canadians of this idea that we're somehow leaders on this file.
Mhm.
We are not, and there's a whole bunch of countries that are kicking our butts.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and interestingly, across the political spectrum too,
Mhm,
right? The country
mhm,
with the most progress in the G7 is the UK,
mhm.
a bunch of which has happened under conservatives. But I want to tell you a story closer to home. Look at Vancouver. Now, I'm biased in this story, Linda, as you probably know, because my wife is Vancouver City Councillor Christine Boyle, who moved the climate emergency motion 2.5 years ago, the first in English Canada. And as a consequence, Vancouver has one of the most ambitious municipal climate plans in North America and a true climate emergency plan. But I want to talk about the politics of it because equally interesting, beyond the fact that the substance of it is real, it's not just symbolic, whether you look at buildings and so on, we could talk about that, is that they passed unanimously these climate emergency motions across a very politically divided council where no party has a majority. Now, how did that happen? Now, part of it is because my wife is very convincing and good as a leader. But if you were to ask her how it happened,
Yeah.
she would say it was it was the students. It was dozens of high school students who skipped school each time and rallied outside and spoke before council and filled the gallery each time these votes happened, and that they made it politically impossible for even the more conservative councillors to vote no. They did that. And as a result, we have a real plan. And it's not a and climate in Vancouver isn't a political wedge issue the way it is in so many other jurisdictions.
And all over the world, young people before COVID were out on the streets and the movement was building. Do you feel like COVID has derailed that movement?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about the positive lessons out of the pandemic, but the unfortunate lesson, but it's an important reminder,
Mhm,
is up until the moment of that first lockdown,
mhm,
momentum was really building.
mhm,
The student mobilizations, first and foremost, were playing an incredible role.
mhm,
The unfolding of extreme weather events were also playing a role.
mhm,
Um, but we had just a few months before the lockdown
mhm.
in September of 2019, we had we had a student-led, youth-led protest that was the largest single day of mobilization in Canadian history.
Yeah.
And then a month before the lockdown, we had these extraordinary solidarity actions in support of the Wet'suwet'en, which
Mhm.
are unlike anything I think we've ever seen as a country. So, so the pandemic has sadly, um, distracted that momentum a little
Mhm.
bit, and we need to recoup it. I think we will.
Mhm.
Um,
But we don't have a lot of time.
no, we don't have time, and that's in a way that's well, this is where I kind of both start and end the book, the ambiguous time in which we live, um, and the fact that I think as a society we are going to do something grand together.
Mhm.
The question is whether or not we'll do it in time. And we don't know. We don't know if we're going to win this fight in time.
No.
Um, but this again is something I take solace from in the World War II story that I tell. I told you earlier, over 1 million Canadians enlisted. out of a population of 11 million, 70% of whom were under the age of 21. You know what they didn't know? They didn't know if they would win. And they did it anyway.
That's inspiring. Seth, the New Deal was a turning point for the United States of America, and the repercussions of it lasted a long time. Unfortunately, they didn't last forever. But Franklin D. Roosevelt had 4 terms totaling 12 years to change American society and improve people's lives. Like, what do you expect to happen in the next 4 years under Biden, with Trudeau, and other of the world leaders who really just don't have 12 years?
Well, this is partly why I'm a huge fan of the Green New Deal and the framing of the Green New Deal. And yet I didn't write a book about the Green New Deal. I wrote a book about World War II because in Canada, we didn't have an original New Deal. And I was looking for an historic example to pull on. And so the war was our New Deal. The war was when we banished unemployment and finally ended that decade of economic hardship. And it wasn't 12 years, it was 6. In fact, we completely transformed the Canadian society and economy twice. Once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert to peacetime in the space of 6 years. So actually, it's for those reasons, I think it's a helpful comparison. I'm heartened by what I'm seeing Biden do out of the gate. I see him starting to hit these 4 markers I talk about. He's talking about spending levels that are starting to get to the level you need to win. He's creating neat new programs like the Citizen Climate Corps and things like that truly invite people into a mobilization. He's setting clear dates where things will be mandatory, like electrifying the whole grid, decarbonizing the whole electric grid. And he is telling the truth about the wind down of the fossil fuel industries in a way that our premiers and prime minister are not yet. You ask, can Trudeau be that person? I don't know. I don't know. This is the funny thing about the story I tell, right? If you had said to Canadians in 1938, this gang in Mackenzie King's government, in his cabinet, do they have what it takes to completely transform Canadian society? I'm certain most Canadians would have said no, and they had no reason to believe otherwise because none of them had shown any inclination to be like FDR. And yet they did.
These circumstances really test all of us, and they test our leaders. We're coming to the end of our time. I have so many questions left to ask you. War mobilizations, it's inherently a top-down effort. How do we make sure we can move quickly in the 9 years we have left to slash emissions while still including people's voices and making sure that we don't run ramshot over the rights of Indigenous people and those most marginalized? What would you say to that, Seth?
Oh, that's a good question. And it's interesting, I mentioned off the top of the book that I wrestle with this analogy. I mean, I cut my teeth in the peace movement. I'm the child of Vietnam draft resistors. That's why I'm Canadian. I don't come easily to this metaphor I'm using. I like what Erin did in her first poem, right? Making a little mischief with that wartime analogy. And what I do in the book, while most of the book it lauds this wartime story, there are a couple chapters that I describe as the cautionary tale chapters. The things in which I consciously detail the things that caused us shame. The squashing of civil rights, the internments, the poisoning of Indigenous land by some of the very crown corporations that were created, and most apt to the climate emergency, the response to refugees, which was shameful, and that's and I consciously include all of those because at the same time as we need our leaders to be like those leaders, we also need them to be different. And we have to go into this emergency mobilization eyes wide open to the sins of the past and committed not to repeat them. And I do also wrestle with this this tension between the fact that at one level, for speed and scale, only the government can achieve that. At some level, it does have to be top down. And on the other hand, how do we do this in a truly democratic way? I think, Extinction Rebellion has called for the widespread use of citizen assemblies, and I very much agree with them. That I
Mhm,
think while we can't put up for debate the targets, we need the targets to be ambitious.
mhm,
How we achieve those targets and involving people in that conversation about how we do that, I
mhm,
think is very well advised. If
mhm.
people feel it to be imposed from on high without consideration of people's realities and concerns, it's not going to go well. And
Really have to have they have to have buy-in
yeah,
big time. Seth, we're coming, yes, here we are at the end of our hour. I just want to tell you all that we're going to have another poem from Erin, and then after that, we're going to wrap up, and I'm going to say goodnight to everybody and get a last word from Seth and Erin. So don't go away. Erin is going to be sharing her final poem in a moment. And I just want to let you know that on June 10th, we have our final event for this season. And it's going to be with author Alex Samuel, who'll be speaking about working from home and its impact on the carbon footprint, like the COVID remote work. Don't forget, you can also catch up with past conversations on our site and on YouTube. And I just want to tell you that tonight's episode was produced by a wonderful team, Shadayer Tashdidi, and a big shout out to my friends and colleagues, Janelle Johnson, Shannon Uechi, and Polly Leger. So I'm going to circle back now to Erin. Erin, we'd love to hear from you again.
I'm gonna read a poem called "Places to Intervene in a System," which is a line from Donella Meadows, the environmental scientist, and it's an ode to activists and to the work that you do, Seth, and to the work that you do, Linda, and to the activists that come in many forms. Places to intervene in a system. No one kept watch except all of us. We made human chains. We wrote operas. We conducted interviews and released the data and thought up everything we could just to stop it. It didn't. We found hope anyway, then lost the case. We lay on our backs and just floated. We saw 150 species a day go extinct. We did not want to be people. We were tired of talking. We started marching. We said, maybe it's over. We delivered a formal apology to the salmon. Did a controversial pregnant photo shoot in front of a nuclear reactor. All those nice curves. We made page 15 of the New York Times. Okay. And delighted in the letters to the editor that said I was going to give my baby cancer. Well, exactly. Then got scared and moved, but it was everywhere we went, like my unstable worth rolling oblongly on pink shadows of information glamping among facts. Friends came and were astronomies. Self-deploying flora volunteered. This morning, the sun shone on the chasmogamous violets, and the world continues in great detail. What shall I do with my information? I'm an animal in an animal in an animal. I'm a poem of objects that live by magic. I'm every idea I ever had. I'll just stay here as a person. The future is peristaltic.
Well, Erin, Seth, thank you so much. You're both amazing writers, and you can find Erin. Where can we find your books?
Oh, I have this book, Reg Cosmology. Probably the best place is from the publisher, which is Book Hug, but it's available anywhere. And
Find books,
I have a website with some other links and another book on the way.
that's so wonderful. So you guys, that's look for Erin at erinrobinsong.ca.
.org.
Seth, it's amazing to have this time with you to talk directly to you, and I really am so impressed and moved by your work, and I really appreciate you being here with us today. So thank you both. I see I see a lot of comments on the chat, Erin. People are just like, wow, wow, wow. And Seth, you've got some big fans.
Yeah, I've been
well.
looking. I've just been looking at the chat. I'm really happy that so many people are enjoying the book. I do want to mention that in the wake of the book, and with support from David Suzuki and Tara Cullis, I've created this new project, the Climate Emergency Unit at the David Suzuki Institute. And I, somewhere back in the chat there, I shared the link to that. It's been amazing to me out since the book came out in September, how resonant this 80-year-old story remains for so many people as a source of inspiration. And can I offer one final thought, Linda?
I'd love that. Please.
Ever since I've been out with this, it frequently comes up that people say, look how people have tired in the pandemic. And, in less than a year, people have COVID fatigue. And here I am asking people to go into emergency mode for a few years. How realistic is that? We were talking about these comparisons with the pandemic, but I want to offer one important difference. The things we have been called upon to do in this pandemic are anathema to all of our social instincts. Stay home, isolate. That's hard. The good news is the things we are called upon now to do in response to the climate emergency are precisely the opposite. To go out and do something grand together. And we can do that for a few years.
I think that with that amazing wrap up from Seth, thank you everybody for being here with us today. Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Seth. Thank you to you 215 or so people still on the call. It's always a pleasure, and we'll see you next time.